Eli Turner lived in a small wooden cabin deep inside the northern Maine woods. The cabin stood alone between tall pine trees, where the wind whispered through the branches and the smell of earth filled the air. For most people, such a place would feel too quiet, too empty, but for Eli it was home. He had lived there for more than 10 years, far from towns and neighbors, surrounded only by the rhythm of the forest, birds singing at dawn, squirrels chattering, and the creaking sound of trees swaying in the wind. Every morning Eli woke before sunrise. The first light of day slipped through the cracks in his old window, falling across the wooden floor. He would put on his thick wool coat, step outside, and breathe in the crisp, cold air. His axe leaned against the porch, always sharp and ready. The forest had become both his workplace and his companion. He cut logs for firewood and shaped them into fine pieces of furniture. His hands were rough and strong, marked by years of work, but there was a quiet gentleness in the way he handled every piece of wood. To Eli, each log held a story, a piece of the forest's long life that he was helping to continue. The nearest town was almost 15 miles away, a long journey through winding dirt paths. He went there once or twice a month to sell his furniture, chairs, tables, and sometimes hand-carved toys for the shopkeepers' children. People in town knew him as the Woodsman. Some said he was kind but strange. Others whispered that no one could live so far from company unless they had something to hide. But Eli had nothing to hide. He just preferred the sound of trees over the noise of people. Crowded places made him uneasy. In the woods he felt peace. There were no expectations, no judgments, only the steady, comforting pulse of nature. Still, sometimes late at night, when the fire burned low and the silence grew too thick, a different feeling crept into his heart, something heavy and lonely. He would look at the rocking chair he had built years ago and remember his mother sitting in one just like it, humming softly while she sewed by the fire. She had passed away when he was still a boy. His father had been a lumberjack, too, a man of few words but great strength, taken by a winter illness long before Eli became a man. After that, Eli had no family left, no one to call his own. Maybe that was why he stayed in the woods. There he could live by the memory of those he'd lost without being reminded of what he no longer had. Eli wasn't bitter. He didn't hate his life or wish for more, at least that's what he told himself. He had built everything with his own 2 hands. The cabin, the furniture, the shed, even the small bridge that crossed the creek behind his home. His life was simple but full of quiet purpose. He found comfort in routine, chopping wood, cooking over the fire, mending tools, and sometimes reading from an old, weathered Bible that had belonged to his mother. Every Sunday, no matter the weather, Eli would walk to the small clearing behind his cabin. There, under a tall oak tree, lay a little wooden cross he had made years ago. He never told anyone whose grave it marked, but he often sat beside it for a while, hat in hand, lost in thought. Sometimes he would talk out loud, though no one was there to listen. The forest had become his silent witness, holding all his secrets. In the summers, his world came alive with color. The air was filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. Deer would wander near the creek, and sometimes Eli would toss them scraps of food, smiling as they cautiously approached. He talked to them as if they could understand. In the winters, however, the world turned harsh. Snow piled high against the cabin walls and the cold bit deep into his bones. During those months, he spoke little, worked slower, and felt the emptiness of the cabin more than ever. When he went into town, people greeted him kindly but distantly. "Morning, Eli," they would say, tipping their hats. He'd nod back with a quiet smile, never one for long talk. Children often stared at him with wide eyes. They found him mysterious, like a character from one of their storybooks. Once, an old woman at the bakery told him, "You've got kind eyes, Mr. Turner, but such a sad face." Eli had simply smiled and said, "Guess it's the forest's doing, ma'am. It teaches you to listen more than you speak." Despite his silence, Eli had a good heart. He often left bundles of firewood by old Mrs. Beckett's doorstep before the first frost, though she never knew who brought them. He repaired broken fences for farmers when no one was watching, and once, when a neighbor's cow went missing, Eli spent all night helping them find it in the woods. He never wanted thanks, just the quiet satisfaction of doing right. But goodness didn't fill loneliness. As the years passed, Eli began to notice small things. How his house echoed too loudly when he coughed. How no one said goodnight to him. How birthdays came and went without meaning. The ache was soft but steady, like a river running beneath frozen ground. He had built his life around silence, but sometimes it felt like that silence was slowly building around him. Every night, Eli lit a single lantern on his windowsill. It was an old habit, one his mother had taught him. A light in the window, she used to say, so no traveler ever feels unwelcome. It had been years since anyone had come down that path, but still, he kept the light burning. Maybe deep down a small part of him hoped that one day someone would see it, someone who needed warmth, someone who might bring a little life back into the lonely cabin. As the autumn leaves began to fall that year, something in the air felt different. The evenings grew colder, and the forest seemed quieter than usual, as if waiting for something. Eli noticed it too. The animals moved early to their burrows. The winds carried a restless sound, and even the stars seemed sharper, brighter. He couldn't explain why, but he felt it in his bones, and a change was coming. Maybe it was just another winter approaching, or maybe it was something else, something meant to break the stillness that had wrapped around his heart for so long. That night, after finishing his supper, Eli stepped outside with his lantern. The forest stretched dark and endless before him. He listened. The soft rush of the creek, the faint hoot of an owl, the whisper of leaves. The world was quiet, yet it felt alive, as if the woods themselves were breathing. Eli smiled faintly and turned toward the cabin. As he placed the lantern on the windowsill, its golden light flickered through the glass, casting a warm glow into the darkness. He didn't know it yet, but that same light would soon guide 3 frightened children and their tired mother to his door, and with them, the beginning of a new life he never expected. That night, the forest outside Eli Turner's cabin was wrapped in darkness and rain. The wind howled through the pine trees, and the sound of thunder rolled across the hills. Eli sat by the fire, sharpening his axe and listening to the storm's wild song. He was used to such nights. In the woods, storms were like old friends, loud, restless, but passing. Yet something about that night felt different. The air carried a strange tension, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He had just poured himself a cup of hot tea when he heard it. A knock. At first he thought he had imagined it. No one ever came this far through the woods, especially during a storm. But then it came again, louder, desperate, and trembling. Eli froze. His cabin was more than a mile from the nearest road. Whoever was knocking must have been wandering in the dark for hours. He set down his cup and opened the door. A burst of cold wind and rain rushed inside. Standing there, shivering and soaked, was a woman holding a small child in her arms. 2 more children, both under 10, clung to her skirt. Their clothes were wet and muddy, their faces pale from the cold. "Please," the woman said, her voice shaking. "Our wagon broke down by the creek. We've been walking for hours. I didn't know where else to go." For a moment, Eli just stared at them. He wasn't used to company, especially not a woman and 3 frightened children appearing out of nowhere. But the look in her eyes and the mix of exhaustion and fear left no room for hesitation. "Come in," he said softly, stepping aside. "Hurry now before you freeze." They stepped inside, dripping water onto the wooden floor. Eli closed the door behind them and threw another log into the fire. The warmth slowly began to fill the room. The children gathered near the flames, stretching their tiny hands toward the heat. Eli handed the woman a blanket and motioned toward his chair. "Sit down, ma'am. You're safe here," he said. "Thank you," she whispered. "My name's Clara Benson. These are my children, Ruth, Peter, and little Sammy." Eli nodded. "Eli Turner," he said simply, feeling strangely shy. "You can dry off by the fire. I'll fetch some tea." As he moved about the cabin, preparing food and towels, he couldn't help glancing at them. The woman looked worn and tired, her face lined with the weight of recent struggles. But her eyes, soft and brown, carried a quiet strength. The children, though shivering, were polite and well-behaved. The little boy, Peter, tried to hide his curiosity, staring at Eli's tools and the hunting trophies on the wall. The youngest, Sammy, was fast asleep in his mother's arms, his small hand clutching her dress. Eli brought over a tray with warm tea, bread, and stew he had made earlier. "It's not much," he said, "but it'll warm you." Clara smiled weakly. "It's more than we've had all day," she said. Her voice trembled, not from fear but from relief. They ate quietly for a while, the sound of rain tapping against the window. The fire crackled, filling the cabin with soft light. When the children finished their meal, Ruth thanked Eli in a small, polite voice. He nodded. feeling a warmth inside that had nothing to do with the fire. As the storm grew louder outside, Eli noticed Clara struggling to stay awake. Her eyelids drooped, her body swayed with exhaustion. He cleared his throat. "There's a spare bed in the back room. The little ones can sleep there. I'll stay out here by the fire." "Oh, we couldn't," she began. But Eli gently raised his hand. "Ma'am, you've come a long way in this weather. You and your children need rest. Don't worry about me." Gratitude filled her tired eyes. She nodded and led the children into the small back room. Eli helped them find extra blankets and made sure the fire would last the night. When the door finally closed and silence returned, he sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He couldn't stop thinking about them. The suddenness of their arrival, the sadness in Clara's eyes, the way the children had huddled together like little birds in the rain. He didn't know their story, but something told him it wasn't a happy one. Still, for the first time in years, he didn't mind the sound of another person's breathing under his roof. The cabin felt alive again. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clean, glistening world. The smell of damp earth and pine filled the air. Eli stepped outside to fetch water, and when he returned, he found Clara already awake, tending to the fire. She had tied her hair back and was preparing breakfast with quiet efficiency, as if she'd lived there for years. "Good morning," she said with a soft smile. "I hope you don't mind. I thought I'd make something for the children." Eli shook his head. "Not at all. Smells better than anything I'd cook." Ruth and Peter sat near the table, whispering and giggling. Sammy, still sleepy, played with a wooden horse that Eli had carved long ago. Watching them, Eli felt something unusual, a kind of peace he hadn't known he was missing. After breakfast, Clara explained what had happened. Her husband had passed away the previous year, leaving her with little money. She had been traveling to a distant town to find work and a new start for her children. But their wagon had broken down in the middle of the forest, and the rain had forced them to walk until they saw the faint glow of Eli's lantern. Eli listened quietly. He could see the pride in her face. She didn't complain or ask for pity. She spoke with the calm determination of someone used to surviving hard days. When she finished, she looked down, embarrassed. "We'll be gone by tomorrow," she said softly. "Once the wagon's fixed, we'll move on." Eli frowned slightly. "The trail's flooded and the road to town will take days to clear. You'd be safer staying here till it dries out." Clara hesitated. "I don't want to trouble you, Mr. Turner." "It's no trouble," he said simply. "The cabin's big enough for all of us. You and the children can stay till the weather improves." She looked at him with quiet surprise, then nodded gratefully. "Thank you," she whispered. Days passed and slowly the cabin began to change. The air felt warmer, livelier. The children filled it with laughter, something Eli hadn't heard in years. Ruth helped wash dishes. Peter followed Eli into the woods, and Sammy often sat on Eli's lap while he whittled wood, giggling at each shaving that fell. Clara, meanwhile, took charge of the home, cleaning, cooking, and bringing small touches of care to every corner. A pot of flowers appeared on the windowsill. A mended curtain replaced the old one. The cabin no longer felt empty. It felt lived in. Eli found himself smiling more, speaking more. The silence he once loved now seemed less comforting when the children were away playing outside. Some evenings he and Clara would sit by the fire after the children were asleep. She would talk softly about her husband, how kind he'd been, how hard the last year had been since his passing. Eli listened, not out of duty, but because her voice was gentle and steady, like the sound of a stream. One night, as they sat by the fire, Clara said quietly, "You've done more for us than any stranger ever would. I don't know how to thank you." Eli looked into the flames for a long moment before replying. "You already have," he said. "You've brought life back into this old cabin." Clara smiled, and for the first time since she'd arrived, her eyes softened, free from worry. The room fell silent, filled only by the soft crackle of the fire and the quiet promise of something new growing between them. Something neither had expected, but both silently cherished. Outside, the last traces of snow melted under the moonlight. The forest, which had once been Eli's only companion, now seemed to hum with quiet joy. The lonely woodsman had opened his door to a widow and her children, never knowing that in doing so, he had also opened his heart. The days slowly turned into weeks. and the forest around Eli's cabin began to shift from the gray chill of winter into the quiet promise of spring. The snow melted into streams that whispered through the trees, and new shoots of grass began to appear beneath the tall pines. For Eli Turner, the change of season brought something he had not felt in years, purpose that went beyond his work. Clara Benson and her 3 children had been with him for nearly a month now. What had begun as an act of kindness during a storm had turned into something neither of them had planned, a fragile but real companionship. The cabin, once filled with silence, was now alive with voices and laughter. Each morning, Eli would wake before dawn, as he always had, but now he could hear soft movements in the other room. Clara rising early to prepare breakfast, the children stirring, their sleepy voices filling the air. The smell of warm bread and coffee greeted him when he stepped out from his room. It was a small thing, yet it felt like a miracle. "Morning, Mr. Turner," Clara would say with a polite smile, wiping her hands on her apron. "Morning, ma'am," he'd reply, feeling an awkward warmth rise in his chest. He wasn't used to being greeted that way, to hearing someone say good morning as though it truly mattered. Peter, the middle child, had taken a liking to following Eli everywhere. The boy was curious about everything: the axe, the saw, the way Eli stacked wood, how he made the perfect notches in the logs. At first, Eli had tried to work quietly and alone as he was used to, but Peter's enthusiasm was impossible to ignore. "Can I help, Mr. Turner?" the boy asked one day, his small hands already reaching for a stick. Eli chuckled softly. "Well, I suppose every woodsman needs a helper." From then on, the two were inseparable. Peter carried small branches, fetched nails, and even tried carving under Eli's patient guidance. The boy's joy reminded Eli of his own youth, those long-ago days when he had followed his father through the woods, watching, learning, listening. Each evening, when Peter proudly showed his mother the tiny wooden birds or horses he had made, Eli felt something bloom quietly in his chest. Ruth, the oldest, was quiet and thoughtful. She helped her mother with the cooking and laundry, humming softly as she worked. Sometimes Eli caught her watching him, curious but shy, as though trying to understand the man who had taken them in. Sammy, the youngest, was full of laughter. He toddled around the cabin, playing with Eli's tools and climbing onto his lap whenever he sat down. One afternoon, Clara found Eli sitting by the porch carving something from a piece of maple wood. "What are you making there?" she asked, stepping closer. He smiled faintly. "A rocking horse. For Sammy." Her eyes softened. "You're very kind, Mr. Turner. You didn't have to." Eli shrugged. "Guess I wanted to." She looked at him for a moment longer before turning her gaze toward the trees. "You've done so much for us already. I don't know how we'll ever repay you." Eli paused his carving. "You don't owe me a thing," he said gently. "The woods give what they can. Maybe I'm just doing the same." Clara smiled then, a small, tired smile that still carried light. For Eli, that smile was worth more than anything he could ever build. As the days passed, the rhythm of life in the cabin began to feel natural. They shared meals together, worked side by side, and told stories by the fire in the evenings. Clara had a gift for storytelling. She could turn even the simplest moment into something magical. The children would sit around her, eyes wide as she spoke about faraway towns, sunny days in fields, and songs their father used to sing. Eli often listened quietly from his chair, pretending to read, though his book remained open to the same page for hours. He found himself drawn to her voice, the way it carried both strength and sadness. It was a voice that had known hardship, but refused to break under it. Still, as comfortable as things had become, there was an unspoken truth hanging between them. They couldn't stay forever. The world outside the forest was waiting, and Clara knew it. She often looked out the window as if thinking about the road ahead, about what came next. Eli saw it too, but never asked. He didn't want to think about the day the cabin would be empty again. One evening, as they cleaned up after supper, Clara finally spoke. "Mr. Turner, I've been thinking," she said quietly. "It's almost spring. The roads will open soon. I should take the children into town and find work. We've stayed long enough. Eli froze, his hand still on the table. The words stung more than he expected. He turned slowly. You don't have to rush, he said. You've got no place waiting out there. The world can be unkind to folks starting over. I know, she said softly, folding her hands. But I can't depend on your kindness forever. You've already done more than anyone else would. He wanted to argue, to tell her that her being there wasn't a burden, but a blessing. But he didn't know how to say it. Instead, he simply nodded. Then stay till you find your footing, he said. The offer stands as long as you need it. Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and something passed between them that words couldn't describe. Gratitude, maybe, or something deeper that neither dared to name. As spring arrived, the world around them grew bright and green. Eli began taking Peter farther into the woods, teaching him how to listen to the sound of falling branches, how to tell when the rain was coming by the smell of the air. Clara planted small patches of herbs and flowers near the porch, saying she missed seeing color. Ruth helped her, while Sammy chased butterflies through the grass. One afternoon, while fixing the roof, Eli heard laughter below. He looked down to see Clara wiping flour from her hands, pretending to scold Sammy, who had dipped his toy horse into a bowl of dough. The children were laughing so hard they could barely breathe. Clara laughed too, freely, fully, the sound echoing through the clearing. Eli stopped hammering and just watched. The sight of her smiling in the sunlight, surrounded by her children, stirred something in him that felt both wonderful and frightening. He realized with quiet certainty that he didn't want them to leave. He had lived alone for years and thought it was enough. But now, the thought of that empty cabin again felt unbearable. That evening, when Clara stepped outside to fetch water, Eli joined her. They stood together under the fading pink sky, listening to the sound of the creek. The woods are different now, Eli said softly. She smiled. Different? Feels warmer, he said. Livelier. Guess you and the children brought that with you. Clara's eyes glistened in the fading light. You've given us safety when we had none. You've given my children a home, even if just for a while. I'll never forget that, Eli. He wanted to tell her she didn't have to leave, that maybe this could be her home too. But the words caught in his throat. He was afraid to say them, afraid that if he did, she might refuse and walk away sooner. So he said nothing. He just stood beside her as the sky turned to dusk, the air cool and still. Somewhere deep in the forest, a nightbird called, and the sound echoed softly between the trees. Inside the cabin, the children were laughing again, their voices spilling out through the open window like music. Eli turned to look at Clara, her face bathed in the gentle glow of twilight, and something deep within him whispered that this quiet, simple moment was what he had been waiting for all along. He didn't know what the future would bring or how long they would stay, but for now they were here. And for the first time in years, Eli Turner wasn't just a lonely woodsman. He was part of something. Fragile, yes, but real. A family, taking shape in the heart of the wilderness, born not from blood but from kindness, trust, and the quiet grace of shared life. The first snow of winter came earlier than anyone expected that year. One morning, Eli Turner stepped outside and found the forest blanketed in white. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with snow. The world seemed softer, quieter, beautiful yet cold. Eli looked toward the horizon and frowned. He had cut plenty of firewood through the summer, but something in his gut told him this winter would be harsher than usual. He could feel it in the air, a biting chill that crept into his bones and whispered warnings only an old woodsman could understand. Inside the cabin, Clara was helping Ruth and Peter pack away jars of food they had preserved, apples, beans, dried corn, and potatoes. The shelves were nearly full, but Clara worried. It might not be enough if the roads freeze, she said one morning. Eli nodded. We'll manage, he replied softly. We always do. By now they had fallen into a rhythm that felt almost like family. Clara no longer called him Mr. Turner. She called him Eli. The children had grown comfortable around him, running to the door each evening when he returned from the woods. They called him Uncle Eli, though in their hearts he had already become more than that. As the snow deepened, life grew slower. Eli spent most days chopping wood and repairing the roof, while Clara mended clothes and cooked meals that filled the cabin with warmth. In the evenings, they sat by the fire together, talking softly while the children played with their toys. The firelight danced across their faces, making the small cabin glow like a world of its own, far from the cold outside. But as beautiful as it was, winter carried its tests. One night Peter began to cough, a deep, stubborn cough that wouldn't stop. Clara did everything she could. She made warm broth, wrapped him in blankets, and stayed by his side, but the cough only worsened. Eli could see the worry growing in her eyes. "The nearest town doctor's 10 miles away," he said, pacing near the fire. "The snow's too thick to travel by wagon." Clara nodded, her voice trembling. "We'll pray it passes. He's a strong boy." Days went by, and though Peter tried to act brave, he grew weaker. Eli couldn't bear to see the boy suffer. He sat by his bedside at night, whispering stories and keeping the fire burning bright. Ruth and Sammy stayed close to their brother, their faces full of quiet fear. On the 4th night, Eli made a decision. Before dawn, he packed a small sled, wrapped himself in layers of fur, and set out toward the town. The storm had calmed a little, but the path was still dangerous, the snow deep, the air sharp as ice. Each step felt heavy, but Eli kept going. He thought of Peter's pale face, of Clara's tired eyes, and that was enough to keep him moving. The journey took hours. When he finally reached the town, his face was numb from the cold. He bought medicine and herbs from the apothecary and turned back toward the forest before sunset. By the time he reached the cabin, night had fallen. Clara ran to the door, her eyes wide with relief. "Eli, you made it!" He smiled weakly, brushing snow from his coat. "Couldn't let the boy down," he said. She took the medicine from his hands, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Eli just nodded, too tired to speak. He sat by the fire as Clara prepared the medicine, her hands shaking but steady. That night she stayed up with Peter, giving him spoonfuls every hour. Eli kept the fire alive, watching the flames dance as the boy's breathing slowly eased. When morning came, Peter finally slept without coughing. The color began to return to his cheeks. Clara turned to Eli, her eyes full of gratitude. "You saved him," she said softly. Eli shook his head. "No, ma'am. We all did." But deep inside, something changed. In that moment, he realized how deeply he cared for them, not just as guests or friends, but as his own. He couldn't imagine his days without the sound of Sammy's laughter, Ruth's quiet songs, or Clara's gentle smile. The cabin had become their shared world, a home built not by blood but by love, patience, and kindness. Winter continued, long and unforgiving. Food grew scarce near the end of February. They rationed carefully, making soup stretch and baking smaller loaves of bread. Yet even in the hardest days, they found joy. They played games by candlelight, told stories, and sang songs Clara remembered from her childhood. One evening, Eli made a small sled for the children. When the snow softened in March, he took them to the nearby hill. Their laughter echoed through the trees as they raced down the slope, cheeks red from the cold, eyes sparkling with joy. Clara stood at the top of the hill watching them, her scarf fluttering in the wind. "You look happy," Eli said, walking up beside her. "I am," she replied softly, "happier than I've been in years." He smiled, his breath visible in the frosty air. "I reckon that makes 2 of us." They stood there for a while, side by side, watching the children play until the sun dipped below the trees. There was no need for words. The quiet between them was full of understanding. Spring finally arrived, and the snow began to melt. Streams flowed freely again, and tiny buds appeared on the trees. Eli's cabin, once surrounded by silence and frost, now buzzed with life. Birds chirping, water flowing, laughter filling the air. One morning, Clara sat on the porch with a basket of laundry. She looked out toward the forest and said softly, "It's hard to believe we've been here almost a year." Eli paused his work and nodded. "Time moves quicker when it's good," she smiled. "I thought we'd just be passing through. But this place, it feels like home." Eli met her gaze. "It's yours as much as mine now." Clara looked down, her cheeks flushing slightly. "You've given us so much, Eli. I don't know what we'd have done without you." He hesitated, his heart full but words failing him. You've given me something too, he said quietly. A reason to come home every day. The breeze carried the scent of blooming pine through the air. For a long moment they sat in silence, both understanding what neither dared to say aloud. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Eli and Clara sat by the fire. She handed him a cup of tea, her hand brushing his. The small touch sent warmth through him stronger than any flame. I used to think, she began softly, that after my husband passed, I'd never feel safe again, that maybe life had given me all the love I'd ever get. But being here, with you, with the children happy again, I see I was wrong. Eli looked into her eyes that carried both sadness and hope. Maybe love doesn't end, he said. Maybe it just finds new ways to come back. Clara smiled, tears glimmering in her lashes. Maybe it does. The fire crackled softly between them, and outside the wind rustled through the trees, not with loneliness this time, but with peace. The hardships of winter had tested them, but in the struggle something strong had taken root. When the children woke the next morning, they found Eli already outside, chopping wood with renewed energy. The forest echoed with the rhythm of his axe, steady, strong, full of life. Clara watched him through the window, a quiet smile on her lips. The lonely woodsman had faced the storm and come through with more than warmth and shelter. He had found a reason to live, a family to fight for, and a love that had grown as naturally as spring returning to the earth. And though neither spoke of the future yet, both knew deep inside that whatever came next, they would face it together. Spring had fully returned to the forest, painting the world in shades of green and gold. The snow was gone, replaced by the soft hum of new life. Birds nesting in the trees, small animals scurrying through the undergrowth, and flowers blossoming along the creek. Eli Turner's cabin had changed too. What had once been a quiet, lonely home was now filled with laughter, chatter, and the scent of warm bread and herbs. Clara Benson and her children had settled comfortably into their life with him. Days were no longer measured by work alone but by shared moments. Morning breakfasts around the wooden table, afternoon walks through the forest, and evenings by the fire telling stories and planning little adventures. Eli had grown used to their presence, and in truth he couldn't imagine life without them. Each child had found a place in his heart. Sammy, the youngest, clung to his hand as they went on errands to the creek. Ruth had taken to helping him in the workshop, learning how to sand and carve small pieces of wood. Peter, full of curiosity, had become Eli's shadow, following him everywhere and soaking in every lesson the woodsman could teach. Eli himself had changed without realizing it. The quiet contentment he had once known in solitude had deepened into something richer. He woke each morning eager to see the children's faces and hear Clara's soft greetings. Even chores felt lighter when they were shared. The cabin no longer felt like a shelter from the world, but a home, a place of warmth, love, and belonging. One morning, Eli took the children to the hill where they had first sledded during the winter. Spring had softened the snow into patches of grass, and the air smelled sweet with blooming flowers. The children ran ahead shouting and laughing, while Eli carried a picnic basket with Clara following behind. The woods were alive with the gentle buzz of insects and the songs of birds, and for a moment everything felt perfect. As they settled near the creek to eat, Clara watched Eli with a quiet smile. He was different now, less reserved, more open, and there was a softness in his eyes she hadn't seen before. It wasn't just the joy of having them in his life. It was the bond that had grown over months of shared struggles, laughter, and care. She thought about how this once lonely man had become the center of their lives without even realizing it. After their simple meal, the children played along the creek while Eli and Clara sat nearby, skipping stones and talking quietly. "You've given us more than we could have hoped for," Clara said softly. "A home, safety, and a family." Eli looked at her, a small smile forming on his lips. "You've given me the same," he replied. "I never thought I'd know what it was to feel this full." Clara nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. "We were meant to find each other, Eli. Somehow the forest brought us together." He chuckled softly, though his voice was tinged with awe. "Maybe it did. I never believed in fate before, but now, I think I understand." The children ran back to them, breathless and smiling, each carrying small treasures from the forest, smooth stones, a feather, a small flower. They laid them out on the picnic blanket, chattering excitedly about what they had found. Eli watched them and realized something important. Life wasn't about solitude or even comfort. It was about moments like this, shared experiences, small joys, and the knowledge that someone loved you no matter what. As evening approached, they returned to the cabin. The sky was painted with the soft hues of sunset, casting long shadows through the trees. Eli lit the fire while Clara put the children to bed, and for the first time in months he sat back and allowed himself to feel completely at peace. He was no longer a man alone with the woods. He was part of something larger, something enduring. Over the next few months, life settled into a new, steady rhythm. Eli taught the children about the forest, which plants were safe to pick, how to listen to the sounds of the trees, and how to follow the trails. Clara shared her wisdom too, teaching the children to read, sew, and cook simple meals. Together they learned to care for one another, forming habits and traditions that felt natural, almost like they had always belonged together. Neighbors who once called Eli a lonely woodsman began to see the change. When they came by, they would notice the sound of laughter spilling from his cabin, or catch glimpses of Clara and the children tending the garden. They remarked quietly to each other about the warmth now present in a place that had once seemed so silent and isolated. Eli never sought recognition, but it pleased him to see that his small world was not only alive for him, but for others too. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Clara and Eli sat on the porch together, watching the children chase fireflies across the yard. "Do you ever think about what life would have been like if we hadn't come here?" Clara asked, her voice soft. Eli thought about it. He remembered the endless winters spent alone, the quiet nights with only the crackling fire for company, the slow ache of solitude that had pressed against his heart. He shivered slightly, not from cold but from memory. "I'd have lived," he said finally, "but it wouldn't have felt like life. You and the children, you made it real." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, and he felt the warmth of her presence. "We've all found our place here," she said. "I don't think we'd trade it for anything." They stayed there in silence for a long time, watching the children and listening to the forest around them. Eli thought about the stormy night when they had first appeared at his door, how uncertain and frightened they had been. He remembered the way the fire had crackled that first night, casting light into the shadows, and how that light had grown into something brighter over the months. Hope, trust, and finally love. As night fell, the cabin glowed warmly against the dark forest. The children were asleep. Clara rested beside him, and Eli felt a peace he had never known before. He understood now that the hardships they had faced together, the cold winters, the sickness, the long journeys, had all been part of the journey to this moment. They had tested him, taught him patience, and shown him the depth of his own heart. In the quiet hours, Eli often thought about the future. He imagined the children growing up strong and kind, carrying the lessons of the forest and the love they had shared. He imagined Clara by his side through the years, their bond deepening with every season. And he imagined himself not as a solitary woodsman but as a father figure, a partner, and a man who had finally found the family he had unknowingly been waiting for all his life. The seasons passed, each bringing its own beauty. Summers were filled with swimming in the creek and picnics under the trees. Autumns brought piles of leaves to jump in and the scent of apples in the air. Winters, though harsh, were now filled with warmth, togetherness, and the joy of shared fires and stories. Every day was different, yet every day carried the same simple truth. They were a family, bound not by blood but by choice, love, and trust. Years later, when neighbors spoke of Eli Turner, they no longer called him the lonely woodsman. Instead, they spoke of the man who had opened his cabin and his heart, the man whose home was filled with laughter, music, and life. They spoke of the woman and children who had arrived one stormy night and stayed forever, and how together they had built a world full of warmth in the heart of the forest. Eli often sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the children play, listening to Clara hum softly to herself, and feeling the gentle rhythm of the woods around him. He knew without a doubt that this was where he was meant to be. The forest had given him many things: solitude, work, and quiet. But it had given him something far greater when he had opened his door that stormy night: a family. And in the soft glow of the firelight, with the laughter of the children echoing through the trees and Clara's hand resting in his, Eli Turner finally understood the truth he had always sought. Life was not about being alone or surviving the winters. It was about connection, love, and the small everyday moments that built a home and a heart full of joy. The lonely woodsman was no longer lonely. The forest had witnessed a miracle, not in the grandeur of nature alone, but in the quiet magic of love, kindness, and family found in the most unexpected way. And in that cabin, tucked among the pines, Eli, Clara, Ruth, Peter, and Sammy lived happily together, their lives intertwined forever, proving that sometimes the greatest gifts come not by choice but by grace.